All right, Shabbos, good morning. Let us begin. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem, very exciting day. We begin by thanking our sponsor, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Sammy and Malka Esterson, for dedicating all of the shiurim and droshos this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchak, Laib ben Aharon HaKohen, Sarah Rachel bas Baruch Avraham, and Hinda bas Henech Efraim. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating the shiurim this week in memory of Paul's sister, Zachrini Shulamis bas Shmuel. We hope that with the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families ein lecham. Also with that, let us begin. We are going to make a run for it today in Meretz Hashem. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem, but we can do it. We are starting on Lamed Dalid Amud Aleph, 34a. We are picking up 23 lines up from the bottom. Matzinu Lemedin, or I will say, if you want to see, you see like the lines get wide, then they get shorter again, then they get wider. Right? It's about 8 lines up from before the first set of wider lines. Matzinu Lemedin. So remember again, we spent. I know we did the first part of this daf yesterday a little bit quickly, but we spent a significant amount of time trying to figure out, number one, the number of tekios, and number two, the notion that the Torah only calls the sounds on Rosh Hashana a trua. We also spent some significant time focusing on the idea that there is a tekiah before the trua and a tekiah after the trua. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Matzinu Lamedin, Shalosh Truos, V'Sheish Tekios, and Ne'emru B'Rosh Hashana. Turns out that there are a total of 3 truos, which we've established, and 6 tekios. 6 tekios. In other words, the 6 tekios, because again, there's a tekiah before and after every trua. So the Gemara says, Shtay midivrei Torah, v'achas midivrei Sofrim. 2 of them are mid'araisa, and 1 of them is midrabanan. So we'll discuss what this means in just a moment. So the Gemara says, for example, Shabbason zichron trua, v'avarta shofar trua. The 2 phrases, Shabbason zichron trua, v'avarta shofar trua, these are midivrei Torah. These are biblical tkiyos, biblical truas, I should say. Yom trua yelachem litalmud ahuba. Remember, the phrase Yom Teruah ultimately comes for another drasha. This was in yesterday's daf, the Gzeir Shava between Rosh Hashana and the Midbar. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, first of the widest lines. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonasan, Achas midivrei Torah, Shtay midivrei Sofrim. He holds, no, 1 of them is Doraisa, and 2 of them are Dirabanan. V'avarta shofar trua midivrei Torah. The phrase V'avarta shofar trua, that's biblical. Shabbason zichron trua, v'yom trua yelachem l'talmud ahuba. But the other 2 phrases, Shabbason zichron trua and Yom Teruah, are ultimately needed for something else. So I will say, I just want to clarify something. When the Gemara says that these are 3 psukim the Gemara is quoting, so the Gemara says that, let's say, we just said 1 of them is Doraisa, 2 of them are Dirabanan. So we'll say, how can you say it's Dirabanan, we're quoting a pasuk? What it means is that 2 of the psukim are used for another drasha. They're used for something else. So tangentially, or kind of like, we'll call it tangentially, they're used to teach us the tkiyas, but that's not the primary thrust of the pasuk. Ma'ila Talmud ahuba. What's the drasha make from the 2 psukim? Mibai bayom v'lo b'layla. We needed to teach us. One of them was needed to teach us Yom Teruah, to teach us that shofar can only be sounded by day and not by night. The idach. Where does the other opinion learn that shofar can only be blown by day and not by night? They learn it out ultimately again from Yom Kippurim of Yovel. So the Gemara says, Yom Kippurim Yaliv, Nigmar Nami Minei, Lipshuta Lefaneh, Lipshuta Lachareha. If that's the case, we're learning out from Yom Kippur. Why not learn out from there also the din that there is a tekiah before the trua, a tekiah after the trua, to which the Gemara says, "Va'avarta ta'aviru lo mashmaluhu." Ultimately, again, because they do not darshan the drasha of va'avarta ta'aviru, says the Gemara. Elamai darshibahu. Ultimately, again, so how do they darshan? Va'avarta kid Rav Masna. Dam Rav Masna. As Rav Masna explained, Va'avarta derech ha'avaraso. We'll say Rav Masna explains that Va'avarta teaches us that shofar must be sounded derech ha'avaraso. If you look at Rashi, Rashi's on both sides of the page over here. This is the left-hand side of Rashi, about 10 lines up from the bottom. Lebeute hafcho v'takabo. To teach us that if you blew the shofar upside down, it would not work. Ta'aviru d'kam rachmana na'avrei biyad. Ta'aviru that the Torah tells us. So you might have thought, when it says ta'aviru, maybe ta'aviru just means that halacha l'maisa, you have to carry it by hand, right? And maybe, again, there's no din, or I was supposed to say, it's a strange havamina, but the havamina maybe is that you would just carry the shofar, and maybe halacha l'maisa, there's no din of sounding it, to which the Gemara says, v'idach d'Rav Masna. The other opinion ultimately learns out from Rav Masna as follows, midishani bidibure. Ultimately, again, since the pasuk went ahead and changed the way it phrased it, ta'aviru biyad, lo matzis amrit. So they both say the notion that ta'aviru means carrying the shofar by hand, that does not seem to be a logical drasha. The Gamar avra mimoshe. Make a gzer shavav avra from Moshe Rabbeinu. Ksiv hacha v'avarta shofar trua. It says over here, posted lashon by the pasuk v'avarta shofar trua. Uksiv hasam v'yitzab Moshe v'aviru kol machane. And it says Moshe Rabbeinu v'yaviru kol machane. Moshe Rabbeinu commanded, they sounded a call in the machane. Ma lahalon bekol, afkan bekol. Just like by Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about a sound, so to over here, V'avarta shofar trua is talking about a sound. Ulahai Tana de Maisila midbar, and according to the Tana who learned that from the midbar, Ima lahalon chatzotzros, afkan chatzotzros. Why don't you say the same way that in the midbar it was trumpets, so to here it's trumpets. Talmud lomar tiku b'chodesh shofar b'kesel yom chayenu. Ezehu chag shachodesh miskasebo, which is the month in which the moon is obscured. Havi omer zeh Rosh Hashana. That's Rosh Hashana. V'ka'am rachmana shofar, and the Torah explicitly uses the lashon of shofar in conjunction with that month. So we'll say. So again, this is so. What comes out of it, just going to say what everybody's agreeing with is we have 3 mentions of shofar. How you darshan those 3 mentions and what you do with those 3 psukim is subject to some machlokes. The bottom line conclusion that the Gemara reached is Torah uses the word trua 3 times. Trua 3 times. We also know that in order for the trua to be effective, ultimately there has to be a tekiah before the trua, a tekiah after the trua. And I'm going to say, so what does this yield us? What does this yield us? 9 sounds. Tekiah, trua, tekiah 3 times. 3 times. And again, hence the Mishnah that said, we blow tekiah, trua, tekiah 3 times by malchias, by shofros, and by zichronos. Good. So we'll say, so now we're going to see the further development of this idea. Iskin Rabbi Avo, bikei sari, tekiah. So listen to this. So Rabbi Avo did something very interesting in Kesaria. What did he do in Kesari? Tekiah, shlosha shvarim, terua, tekiah. So we'll say, look what he blew. He blew a tekiah, 3 shvarim, a trua, and the tekiah. What we call tekiah, shvarim trua, tekiah. Now, why did he go ahead? And blow this? So he figured like this: manavshach, I yelule yalil la'avir, tekiah trua tekiah. V'i genuchei ganach la'avid tekiah shlosha shvarim tekiah. So misveikas will say. So the Gemara is saying, Rabbi Avo, what are you doing? Remember, Rabbi, get back to yesterday's daf. All the Torah tells us is you have to blow a trua. Wait a machlokes. What was the machlokes? What's a trua? Is the trua what we call ginuche ganach, like a moaning, what we would call shvarim? Is it a more repetitive cry, what we would call a trua? So Rabbi Avo wasn't sure. He wasn't sure. And therefore, again, what did he do? He did them all. He did a tekiah, shvarim, trua, and a tekiah. This way he covered all of his bases. So the Gemara says, Maskef la Rabbi Avira, the Dilma Yelule Hava, the Kamafsik Shlosha Shvarim, Bein Trua tekiah. So I will say, here's the problem with that. Maybe at the end of the day, really the real sound of trua is what we call trua, right? But here's the problem. Remember, what is Rabbi Avo blowing? He's blowing a tekiah, shvarim, trua, tekiah. The problem is, if trua is really what we call trua, then what? There's a hefsik, there's an interruption. So I will say the halacha is, in order for the unit to work, there can't be any interruption between the bookend tekios and the middle sound. If you're wrong, and what we call TORAH is really TORAH, then what? The shvarim you're blowing before the TORAH interrupts as a hefsek between the first tekiah and the middle sounds. And is that not problematic? So the Gemara says, it's okay. The hadar avid tekiah, TORAH utekiah. It's okay because he also sounded a tekiah, a TORAH, and the tekiah. Maskif la Ravina, v'dilma genuche hava. Maybe the real sound of TORAH is what we call a shvarim. And if that's the case, v'kamafseka TORAH bein shvarim the tekiah. And if that's the case, then when he blows a tashrat, a tekiah, shvarim TORAH, tekiah, he's making a hefsek between the last tekiah and the middle sound, to which the Gemara says, the hadar avid tashat. He blew shvar tekiah, shvar tekiah. So I'll say, so again, just understand what happened over here. The Gemara introduced this by saying, Rabbi Avo introduced this new idea that we should blow tekiah, shvarim TORAH, tekiah, because this way you cover all your bases. To which the Gemara says, well, not necessarily, because if you're wrong about that sound, right? In other words, let's analyze this. If what we call TORAH is really shvarim, so you have tekiah, shvarim, but then you have another sound in there called TORAH, and that interrupts between the shvarim and the tekiah. And reverse, if let's say the real sound that we call TORAH is really TORAH, you're blowing a tekiah, a shvarim, that shvarim interrupts between the TORAH and the first tekiah, and then your second tekiah. So therefore, the Gemara says, no. What Rabbi Avo did like this is he blew 3 sets of 3 different kinds of sounds. He blew tekiah, TORAH, tekiah, tekiah, shvarim, tekiah, and tekiah, shvarim, TORAH, tekiah. Let's say, sounds familiar? That's what we do. The first 30, now we blow a lot more than that, but the first 30 kolos that we blow are 3 sets of what we call tashat, tekiah, shvarim, tekiah, 3 sets of tarat, tekiah, TORAH, tekiah, and 3 sets of tashrat, tekiah, shvarim, TORAH, tekiah. Because this way what we do is, no matter what the definition of TORAH is, we're covered. The Gemara says, well, no. There's one variation that you're not covering, which is what? Right? Tarshat, tekiah, TORAH, shvarim, tekiah. So why don't you blow that? We're blowing a tashrat, tekiah, shvarim, TORAH, tekiah. But why don't you blow a tarshat, tekiah, TORAH, shvarim, tekiah? So here we go. The Gemara says, Ihachi, le'avinami ipcha, tekiah, TORAH, shlosha, shvarim, tekiah, dilma, yalil, veganach. So why don't you blow that variation, right? Why don't you both say tekiah, TORAH, shvarim, tekiah? Go ahead and blow tekiah, short cries, TORAH, longer cries, shvarim, two, and then tekiah. To which, and that's very helpful when I do that. So the Gemara says, no, ki misra be'inish milsa b'rei shaganach v'hadar yalo. So this is very friendly. Gemara says that's not how people cry. When people cry, remember again about yesterday's daf, the TORAH ultimately is learned out from the mother of Sisra. Right? Remember again, Torah says Yom TORAH. We translate TORAH as Yevava, a cry. Vatiyavev im Sisra, the mother of Sisra cried. How do people cry? So 2 different types of cries. There's a shvarim cry, elongated sobs. There is shorter cries like the TORAH, the staccato type cries, tu. So the Gemara says when people cry, the nature of crying is such is that people first go ahead and sob in prolonged sobs, and then after they get a bit more excited, in a sad way, they go ahead and they utter the smaller staccato cries. So therefore, again, the notion of a tekiah, TORAH, shvarim, tekiah is not the way people cry, and therefore, again, we don't have, which is really actually quite an amazing idea, because also remember again, also Rashi pointed out on Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis that the notion of the shvarim cry is like the cry of cholim, and then the TORAH ultimately, again, he says, is the cry of mourning. So I'll say it's almost like a progression of sadness to a certain degree. The cholik cry is a cry ultimately of desperation, of difficult circumstances. The TORAH is almost a cry of yeosh, of giving up, which is such an incredible yisod. You'll say, what does that have to do with Rosh Hashana? There's no yeosh in Rosh Hashana. Like Rabbi Nachman says, Ein shum yeosh ba'olam klal. There's no yeosh in the world at all. We'll say it's not a yesh of giving up on ourselves, but remember again, the whole notion of shofar is tied into the mother of Sisra. The whole cry of the mother of Sisra is the cry when you have to acknowledge your realities and embrace what is, instead of living behind the facade, which all too often we do. So the way it works, I will say, is first I'm upset when my illusions in life prove to be untrue. That's the shvarim. The TORAH, which is the cry of yeyosh, is not a yeyosh on life, but it's a yeyosh, it's a giving up on my illusions. I'm tired of perpetuating the illusions of life. I'm tired of perpetuating the mistruths of life. I give up on them. I give up on them. I'm ready to embrace the reality of what is and ready to maximize what is. So the Gemara goes weiter. If we'll say, remember again, this was an interesting case. You go ahead and you blow one tekiah, a double tekiah. We spoke about this case many times. You blow a double tekiah, so you only get one tekiah out of that. I'm Rabbi Yonasan, I'm Rabbi Yochanan, sorry. Shama, Amud Beis. Shama teisha tekiyos, petesha sha'os bayom. Was a very interesting case. Let's say you heard, so remember again, what we've established is what you need to hear in Rosh Hashanah is 9 sounds. How does 9 become 30? How does 9 become 30? Because again, we're just not sure what those 9 are. Okay, fine. So you must listen to this case. Let's say you heard 9 tekiyos in 9 hours. In other words, you spread over your tekiyos over the day. Yatsa, you yotze. That supports this. Shama teisha tekiyos b'teisha sha'os. If you heard 9 tekiyos over 9 hours, bayom, yatsa, you yotze. Mitespene adam ke'echad lo yatsa. What happens if you have 9 ba'alei tokea, 9 ba'alei tokea, and they blow 9 sounds simultaneously? You're not yotze. Now, we'll say, now why are you not yotze? With that, Rashi says over here, mitisha b'nei adam ke'echad lo yatsa, trei koli lo mishtamai. Because we'll say that's a general principle we hold, that 2 sounds, 2 voices cannot be heard simultaneously. So when you hear 9 sounds simultaneously, you're not actually hearing 9 sounds. So the Gemara says, Tekiah mizu, utrua mizeh, yatsa. We'll say, what happens if you hear a tekiah from one person, a trua from another person, a tekiah from another person? You yotze. Now we'll say, now what is it? Now what's interesting in those 2 cases? Case number 1, there are 3 cases here so far. Case number 1 is you heard 9 sounds over the entire day. Okay, what's that halacha? Yotze. Case number 2, you hear 9 sounds simultaneously from 9 people. What's that halacha? Not yotze. What happens if you hear 9 sounds from 9 people in progression? Right? What's that halacha? You're yotze. That goes back to the previous case of hearing 9 sounds over the course of the day. You're yotze. Va'afilu b'serigin. Afilu b'serigin. Now this is true even if the sounds are not sounded continuously. Va'afilu kol hayom kulo. And even if they are sounded throughout the day. So the Gemara says, did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? V'amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadak b'halelu b'megillah imsha kedei ligmor es kula chozer l'rosh. So yet Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadak that when saying Hallel and Megillah, if you go ahead and you tarry in the recitation of these items and you have a hefsek, and the hefsek is long enough to be able to complete the Hallel or the Megillah in its entirety, what's the halacha? You have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the beginning. So you see that Rabbi Yochanan holds that halacha l'maisa, if you have a hefsek that's long enough to complete the entire matter at hand, that requires you to go back to the beginning. So how can you say that you could blow 9 tekiyas over the course of the day? I will say inevitably what's going to happen over the course of the day, you're going to have a hefsek. If you have a hefsek, what should that require? Going back to the beginning. To which the Gemara says, you're right, Balo kasha hadidei hadirabe. But say ultimately again, Rabbi Yochanan is espousing 2 different shitos. When he quotes over here that if you have a hefsek in the reciting of Hallel or the Megillah, enough time to go ahead and recite the whole thing that you have to go back to the beginning, that's the shita of his Rebbe. But Rabbi Yochanan himself does not hold that. Rabbi Yochanan himself holds that even if you had a massive time delay, as long as what? You could have a time delay as long as what? Nothing else is happening in that time. In other words, let's go back for just a moment. When the Gemara says that you could blow 9 tekiyos over the course of the day, from a tekiah perspective, what that would require is that halacha l'maisa, you're not blowing any other sounds in the middle of those 9. So you want to spend the whole day blowing tekiyas. You space out 9 tekiyas, 9 sounds over the course of the day, that's fine, as long as there's no other sounds happening in that time. By Hallel and Megillah, you want to go ahead and take your time and say the whole day, that's fine. But you can't have anything else then happening in the middle of that Hallel or the Megillah. So that's Rabbi Yochanan's position. His Rebbe holds that if there's a pause, and the pause is long enough in which to have completed the entire mitzvah at hand, that requires you to go back to the beginning. So the Gemara says, really, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold to say v'didei lo v'ha Rabbi Avo hava shakil v'azil basrei Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Avo one time was following after Rabbi Yochanan v'have karei kriyas shma, and Rabbi Avo was saying Shema. Kimat l'mavuos metunafos, when they passed by alleyways, dirty alleyways, and therefore again, I guess there was either an offensive odor or offensive items there, and they could not recite kriyas shma in that alleyway. Ishtik. Rabbi Avo was silent. Basar de Chalif, after they came out of the alleyway, Amar Lahu, Rabbi Avo said to Rabbi Yochanan, Mahu Ligmar. Now that I paused in the recitation of Shema, can I go back and finish where I left off? Amar Le, to which Rabbi Yochanan responded, Im Shahisa Kedei Ligmar Eskula Chozer LeRosh. If you waited long enough to what? Recite the entire Shema, then you have to go back. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see that Rabbi Yochanan himself holds of this idea of hefsek, that if you have a hefsek that is long enough in which to complete the entire Shema, you have to go back and repeat the whole thing. To which the Gemara says, no. Haki Kamal, this is what Rabbi Yochanan was saying. Lididi lo svirli. From my perspective, Rabbi Yochanan says, waiting or having a hefsek does not require you to have to go back and start from the beginning. However, lididach the svirlach im shahisa ligmar eskula chozer l'rosh. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan says, according to Rabbi Avo, I know how you hold. You hold of the din of hefsek, like my Rebbe, and therefore halacha l'maisa, if you waited long enough to be able to go ahead and repeat the entire Shema, or say differently, if your hefsek was long enough that you could have said the entire Shema, then you would be obligated to go ahead and start again. So I will say, I just want to point out, technically speaking, this Shulchan Aruch adopts this halacha, that if you sounded the 9 tekiyas over the course of the day, you're yotzei. If you heard the 9 tekiyas from 9 people, you're yotzei. Again, not simultaneously, but over the course of the day, you're yotzei. Again, the only caveat is you cannot have heard any, we'll call it alien kolos, in the midst of those 9. So for example, if you're hearing tekiyah, 3 hours later you're hearing a shvarim, 3 hours later you're hearing tekiyah, that could work, as long as in the middle of the tekiyah and the shvarim, you're not hearing anything else. So again, technically speaking, it works to hear spaced out tekiyos. Technically speaking, it works to hear 9 tekiyos from 9 different people, as long as, again, they're not simultaneous, they're spaced out, and as long as there's no what we'll call foreign is better, foreign kolos that are being sounded in the midst of those 9. Again, practically speaking, Pashas, we don't do this. Tanrabanan, tekiyos ein ma'akvos zu ad zu. So what's an interesting halacha? So Bryce says tekiyos are not ma'akev one another. Not ma'akev one another. So I will say, well, we'll see what this means. Brachos ein ma'akvos zu ad zu. Similarly, again, brachos. I will say, pashtos, what this means is brachos of Shmona Esrei are not ma'akev one another. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi understands over here, tekiyos ubrachos da'alma kegon ta'anios ein ma'akvin zu ad zu in berach v'lo taka. So we'll say, listen to this. So what the Brisa introduces us, actually those of us who are doing Mishnah Yomi, we're learning these Mishnayos now, Maseches Tainis, about the fast days, about the special, the 24 Bracha Shmona Esrei have a fast day, the different shofar blasts have a fast day. So listen to this. So therefore the Brisa on this, Rashi and the Brisa is talking about over here, that on a regular fast day, the tekiyos are not ma'akev. In other words, if you don't sound all of the shofar blasts, but only sound some of them, it's fine. The brachos of Shmona Esrei, if you don't sound all of them, if you don't say all of them, ultimately, again, they are not ma'akev. So the Gemara says, however, tekiyos ubrachos shel Rosh Hashanah shel Kippurim ma'akvos. But this is very interesting. But the tekiyos and the brachos of Rosh Hashanah are ma'akev. Now we'll say, now what does this mean? My taima, Amra Kodesh Baruch. So we'll say, b'pashtos, what this means is like this. It sounds like what it's saying over here is that halacha l'maisa, the tekiyos and the Shmona Esrei of Rosh Hashanah are intertwined. They are a unit which are ma'akev one the other. So why is this? Amra Kodesh Baruch Hu, Imru Lafanai B'Rosh Hashana Malchios, Zichronos V'Shofros, Malchios Kadesh Tamlichuni Alechem, Zichronos Kadesh Shabol Lefanai Zichronechem, Letova Ubama B'Shofar. So both say, ultimately, again, the Gemara says like this, because interestingly enough, by Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros, the Shofar and the Shmona Esrei are intertwined. How so? So the Gemara says, why do we say Malchios? In order to coronate HaKodesh Baruch Hu. Why do we say Zichronos? So that our favorable memory should rise up before HaKodesh Baruch Hu. And how do we accomplish both of these things? Through Shofar. Shofar is the way we coronate HaKodesh Baruch Hu. How does our memory ascend, positive memory ascend before HaKodesh Baruch Hu? Through the Shofar. Why the Shofar? What does the Shofar Kaviyachol remind HaKodesh Baruch Hu of? Remind Hashem of? The Akedah Yitzchak. And the willingness for Avraham Avinu ultimately to sacrifice his son, the willingness for Yitzchak to be sacrificed, is a schus for Klal Yisrael. So interestingly enough, the Gemara posits, this is why the Shofar and Shmona Esrei are intertwined, because the essence of the Shmona Esrei of Rosh Hashanah is Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros, and Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros are only accomplished through Shofar. So I will say, we paskin halacha l'maisa that they're not ma'akev, right? That they're not ma'akev. Ideally, they are intertwined, but let's say you only have one, but you don't have the other. Can you go forward and go ahead and do it? Of course. In other words, if I don't have a shofar, I still daven Shmona Esrei. If I can't daven Shmona Esrei, I still blow a shofar. But in an ideal sense, they are truly intertwined. The shofar and Shmona Esrei are truly one unit. Misha Berach, V'achakach nisman al shofar, Tokia umaria v'tokia. So remember again, we saw in the Mishnah that let's say somebody daven Shmona Esrei, and they didn't have a shofar by Shmona Esrei, so they didn't sound the shofar by Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros. So what's the halacha? What's the halacha? After Shmona Esrei, they sound 9 kolos. Says the Gemara, Taimad havili shofar meikara. The reason they ultimately again didn't sound it during Shmona Esrei is because they didn't have a shofar. Ha havili shofar meikara kish. Shamalahu aseda brachos shamalahu. So both say, what do you see from this? You see from this that the only reason that they're blowing the shofar after Shmona Esrei in this case is because they did not have a shofar. But halacha l'maisa, if they had a shofar during Shmona Esrei, they would have sounded the shofar during Shmona Esrei. And I both say, now what's the chiddush over here? When we speak about Misha Berach, right? Who are we talking about over here? An individual. Somebody davened. Didn't have a shofar, they find the shofar, they get a shofar after Shmona Esrei. What should they do? Blow the kolos. The Gemara is making a fascinating inference from here. What if I was davening myself, but I had a shofar? What would I do? What does it sound like? Sounds like you would blow shofar during your private Shmona Esrei. Isn't that incredible? So the Gemara says, that's what it says, shofar. The reason I, as an individual, blowing shofar after Shmona Esrei is because I didn't have a shofar during Shmona Esrei. So the Gemara says, shofar meikara. If I would have gone ahead and had a shofar to begin with, I would have sounded that shofar during my private Shmona Esrei. So I will say what it sounds like over here is that halacha l'maisa, even if I'm davening alone and I have a shofar, I blow shofar over the course of Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros. So both said, watch this story. Rav Papa Bar Shmuel, Kam L'Tzaluye. Rav Papa Bar Shmuel was davening by himself. He got up to daven. Amar Le L'Shameh, he said to his servant, Ki nihirna l'cha. When I motion to you, takali, blow the shofar for me. Incredible, right? So he says, just understand what's happening over here. Rav Papa's davening by himself for whatever the reason. He says to his servant, I'm davening Shmona Esrei. When I get up to Malchios, I'm going to motion to you. And what? Blow the shofar for Malchios. When I get up to Zichronos, I'm going to motion to you, blow the shofar. Shofros, blow for me. So Rava said, no, we don't do this. Lo amru ella b'chaver ir. Both say the only time we blow shofar as part of Shmona Esrei is when you're davening with a kehilla. Rashi says, chaver ir, chaburas tzibur. Aval yochen mevarech eskulu v'achagach tokea teisha tkiyos. So the Rebbe comes and says, no, the only time we blow shofar, both say, now this goes back to yesterday's conversation as well. There is a minhag to also blow shofar during silent Shmona Esrei. but that is only true if you're davening with the tzibor. It's only with the tzibor that we blow shofar as part of Shmona Esrei, either as part of personal Shmona Esrei or Chazaras Hashatz. But if you are davening on your own during, right, for Shmona Esrei, you daven your Shmona Esrei, you're not mafsik, you do not make a hefsik, an interruption in your Shmona Esrei, and you'll blow your 9 kolos after Shmona Esrei. That supports this. Kishu shoman ala seder va'al seder brachos. When you go ahead and you hear the shofar, you should hear the shofar as part of the brachos. Malchius, zichronos, and shofars. When is that so? Bechaver ear. That's true when you're davening as part of a tzibor. Both say first wide line, 34b, Lamadal, Beis. Aval shalo bechaver ear, shoman ala seder, v'shalo al seder brachos. Both say, but listen to this. When you're not davening as part of a tzibor, you should hear it ala seder. Now, ala seder means blow the tekios in an order, but not al seder brachos, but not as part of Shmona Esrei. So when you are davening by yourself, you do not interrupt Shmona Esrei during Malchi, Zachronos, and Shofar to blow the shofar. Rather, you blow the shofar after you finish your Shmona Esrei. V'yachid shelo taka, chavero takehilla. So we'll say, and by the way, that is halacha l'maisa, right? That is halacha l'maisa. So again, different congregations have different minhagim, but again, if we're blowing as part of Malchi, Zachronos, and Shofros, that's only in a tzibor. If a Yachid is ever by himself, we'll say it's incredible, right? We would think a couple of years ago, what an esoteric halacha, a yid davening by themselves on Rosh Hashana. But yet again, we all experience that. So at the end of the day, we partially experienced that. So at the end of the day, the Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, when you're davening by yourself, daven your Shmona Esrei, blow your tekiyas afterwards. So what next case? Second wide line. And a person who did not blow the shofar, his friend could blow for him. Okay, your friend could be motzi you. Now watch this. What if you did not daven Shmona Esrei? Can your friend be motzi you in Shmona Esrei? So the Gemara says, no. Umitzvah, so now what I want to point out is we're going to get to this discussion just a little bit. Now, what we're going to see, there's a machlokes about what a shliach tzibor is able to accomplish. What the Gemara is highlighting over here is like this. One thing that can't happen is, if I don't know how to daven Shmona Esrei, my friend can't be motzi me in Shmona Esrei. In other words, so let's say I'm standing with Ruvain, right? I don't know how to daven, Ruvain knows how to daven. So it can't be that Ruvain davens out loud and I listen to him and I'm yotzei with him. That won't work. A shliach tzibor in the context of a minyan may work. We'll discuss that in just a moment. But an individual being motzi me will not work. Individual could be motzi me in shofar, right? Almost, by the way, in almost any other mitzvah, right? Someone else could be motzi my obligation. But in tefillah, another individual cannot be motzi me in tefillah. Both say, now watch this last Gemara. Umitzvah betokin yosem and amabarchim. And I both say, there is a greater mitzvah to hear tekiyah shofar than there is to daven. Get ready for this. Keitzad. Both say this, and by the way, this case is codified in Shulchan Aruch. Shtei ayaros ba'achas tokin ba'achas mevarchin holchin lemakom shetokin vein holchin lemakom shemevarchin. Both say, let's say there are two cities. City A, I can hear tekiyah shofar. City B, there's a minyan to daven. Which city should I go to? And both say, by the way, I'll compound the issue. Let's say I don't know how to daven Shmona Esrei on my own. I don't know how to daven. So I need a minyan. Why do I need a minyan? Not just for a minyan person. Why do I need a minyan? Because I need a shliach tzibor to be motzi me in tefillah. So this is my choice. I could go to a city where there's tekiyah shofar, or I could go to a city where there's a minyan I could daven. Which one do I go to? So the Gemara says, you go to the city of tekiyah shofar. So the Gemara says, oh, well, that's not such a chiddush. What a build-up for nothing. Pshita, haduraisa d'Rabbanan. Both say it's not such a chiddush. Tekiyah shofar is d'oraisa. There's biblical obligation to the shofar. Tefillah is d'Rabbanan. We'll say, watch this. The afagav the havadai v'hasafek. We'll say, what's the chiddush? Get ready for this. City A. I heard a rumor that there's a Baal Tokea. A rumor, but it's not necessarily solidified. Right? I don't know for sure. City B, I know they have a chazan. And mamish, not any chazan, like the chazan, right? Davening is 7 hours. That's incredible, right? So I'll say, so again, so now I have a safek shofar, vadai tefillah. Which one do I go to? Safek shofar, vadai tefillah. The Gemara says, you go to safek shofar. So I will say, so again, The truth is, it's still not such a chiddush because again, it's still a suffix in a daraisa. Suffix daraisa is going to be l'chumra. But if you delve down into this, there's actually two primary reasons. First of all, again, the notion of tefillah is an avodah shebalev. And because of that, technically speaking, one could accomplish tefillah in any meaningful dialogue with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, it's true, I'm not going to have malchias, zikronos, and shofaros, but the ikar essence of tefillah I accomplish with a simple dialogue with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But Rabbi say, once again, it highlights the fact that why is shofar more important than tefillah? Why is it more important than tefillah? Okay, leaving aside one is biblical, one is rabbinic, on a deeper level, this goes back to Vatiyavivim Sisra. Rabbi say, what is the entire essence of shofar? The entire essence of shofar is to bring down the illusions of life, to stop engaging in self-delusional practices. The whole reason why so often we do not gain real traction in life is because I'm unwilling to be honest with myself about who I am. I'm unwilling to be honest about what my challenges are. I'm unwilling to be honest about the things that I'm doing that I know are wrong, that I should not be doing. Yet I refuse to stop. And we all do this. This is why shofar is the cornerstone of Rosh Hashanah. Right, the mother of Sisra saying, oh, Sisra will be home any minute, right? And the sun goes down, he'll be home. She knows he's not coming home. But she refuses to let go of the facade. She refuses to let go of the illusion and delusion. And the whole yisod of Tekiyah Shofar is I have to stop engaging in self-delusional practices. We create entire constructs and entire hashkafas to justify things that we do that we know are really not correct. We create a whole intricate network of personalistic excuses to allow us to get away with things that we know are not really the right thing to do. Well, at the end of the day, and again, we create a whole complicated argument of everyone who's at fault for why my life is like it is. The only person always missing from that equation is me. And Rosh Hashanah, the entire essence of shofar, is to drop the illusions, to drop the delusions, because that is the only way I can move forward. And therefore the halacha says, if you have a choice between Tekiyah Shofar and Tefillah, you got to take shofar. Because there's no tshuva, there's no Rosh Hashanah, there's no Aseret Tzimit tshuva, there's no Yom Kippur, there's no tshuva, there's no comprehensive cathartic process of tshuva without shofar. So if you have a choice between davening and hearing Tekiyah Shofar, we'd rather hear Tekiyah Shofar because that is what is most necessary, ultimately, again, to engage in the process of tshuva and to create an impactful year ahead. The Gemara goes weiter. So remember again, about say in the Mishnah said the same way that the shliach tzibur is chayiv to daven, so every single yachid, every individual is obligated to daven as well. But Gamliel says that the shliach tzibur is motzi the congregation. So says the Gemara, let's analyze Tanya. Rabbi Gamliel, if you're correct that the shliach tzibur is motzi the congregation, so lama tzibur mispalelin, then why does the tzibur have to daven at all? And I was well say it's a good kasha. So again, if you're going to have chazar sashatz to discharge the obligation of the tzibur, then why do the individuals have to daven? Amar lahem, this is incredible. Kadei lahazdir shliach tzibur tfilaso. This is incredible. Also in Rabbi Gamliel's model, do you know how he davens silent Shmona Esrei? To give the shliach tzibur time to organize himself for chazar sashatz. Incredible. I will say, by the way, it tells you how important preparation is for any particular life endeavor. Right? So we're going to have the entire congregation daven a personal Shemona Esrei, even though they don't need to. They don't need to because they can discharge their obligation with the Shliach Tzibor, but we need to give the Shliach Tzibor time to organize himself. Because if you want to be successful in any particular life endeavor, including Chazar Sashatz, it requires proper preparation. Incredible. So Rabbi Gamliel says to Rabbanan, but according to you, that everybody has to daven on their own anyway, why have Chazar Sashatz? Now that's a good kasha, right? That is a good kasha. Why are you doing Chazar Sashatz if everybody's davening anyway? Amrulo, they said to Rabbi Gamliel, Kedei lahoti she'eno baki. Because again, there are always those in the kehilla who don't know how to daven on their own. And therefore, again, the Shliach Tzibor is there in order to help them in this process, to be motzi them. So Rabbi Gamliel says, well, listen, Amr Lahem, Kashim Shemotzi She'eno Baki, Kach Motzi Esavaki. Rabbi Gamliel says, well, look, you got to be honest. If Chazar Sashatz works for the person who doesn't know how to daven, then what? It works for everyone. In other words, either it works or it doesn't work. Either the Shliach Tzibur can be motzi other individuals in tefillah, or he can't. Okay, you might say some should rely on it, some shouldn't rely on it. Rabbi Gamliel says, Bepashtos, if it works for one, it works for all. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan, Modim Chacham Rabbi Gamliel. Ultimately, so the Gemara's Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan, the Chachamim agreed with Rabbi Gamliel that halacha lemaisa, that I will say that the shliach tzibur can be motzi the rabbim, even if the rabbim know how to daven. According to Rabbi Gamliel, the shliach tzibur could still be motzi them. Rav said adayin hi machlokes, that it's still machlokes Rabbi Gamliel and the chachamim. So because remember again, the fundamental machlokes is the chachamim hold that halacha lemaisa, the only time the shliach tzibur can be motzi you is when? Is if you don't know how to daven. Rabbi Gamliel says shliach tzibur can be motzi everyone. So the Gemara Rabbi Chia Berei Rabba Bar Nachmani Azol Amr L'Shmaite Kamei Rav Dimi Bar Chinina. So we'll say, Rabbi Chia Berei Rabba goes in and tells over this ruling. Amr Lei Hachi Amr Rav Adayin Hi Machlokes. The Machlokes is still in existence, right? The Machlokes is still in existence. What is the nature of Chazaras Hashatz? Rabbi Gamliel is saying everyone can be Yotzei with the Shliach Tzibor. The Rabbanan saying only those who don't know how to daven on their own. Amar le Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Amar le Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Nami Hachi Kamar, Ki Amar Rabbi Yochanan LaHashmaisa, Iflig Ale Reish Lakish Amar Adayin Hi Machlokes. Okay. Omi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi. Did Rabbi Yochanan say that it's still Machlokes? Vam Rabbi Chana Tzipora, Rabbi Yochanan Hilchasa Ki Rabbi Gamliel. The halacha follows Rabbi Gamliel. So the Gemara says Hilchasa Michlal de Pligi. So let's analyze this for just a moment. So when you say the halacha follows Rabbi Gamliel, what that's so we'll say the only time you need to make a declarative statement that the halacha follows someone is when halacha l'maisa there's a machlokes. But at the end of the day, if there's no machlokes, you don't have to say anything. The fact that you say that halacha follows Rabbi Gamliel indicates to us that there is still a machlokes. Top of Lamed Hey. So the Gemara says Kisalik Rabbi Abba Yomi. This is actually very interesting. Rashi says, Kislev Rabbi Abba means shehiflik b'sfina liyam v'chazar. Apparently, Rabbi Abba went out he traveled by boat, and then he came back. So when he came back after his boat travel, he said, Pirsha modim chachamim Rabbi Gamliel bebrachos shel Rosh Hashana v'shel Yom Kippurim. Wow. So both say, now the Gemara just did something absolutely amazing. So both say, up until this point in time, we've kind of been looking at this machlokes as kind of like one bucket, right? And what's the bucket? The bucket is tefillah, right? Tefillah. So, and our fundamental machlokes is, can I, a person who knows how to daven, be yotzei with the shliach tzibor? That's really the ikar kasha over here. Rabbi Gamliel, right? So the Rabbanon will say no. The Rabbanon will say, and I will say this goes back to brachas, by the way, that the ikar takana of chazaras hashatz was who? Kedei lahotzi, in order to discharge the obligation of those who don't know how to daven. But those who do know how to daven cannot be yotzei with the shliach tzibor. To which Rabbi Gamliel responds, that doesn't make any sense. If chazaras hashat works for some, then what? Technically, it has to work for all. Now again, I want to be clear. Rabbi Gamliel is not saying that you should rely on chazaras hashatz. Rabbi Gamliel is talking about just the mechanics. Can you rely on chazaras hashatz? If it works for some, it's got to work for everyone. Now, both say, now watch this. Rabbi Abba comes off the boat, and he says something amazing. He says, no, we have to distinguish between the tefillos of Yamim Noraim and the tefillos of the rest of the year. That it could very well be that the machlokes between the Chacham and Rabbi Gamliel is in the tefillos of the rest of the year. But by Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur, the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Gamliel that what? That anyone and everyone could discharge their obligation for tefillah by listening to Chazaras Hashatz. I just want to point out something interesting. Why does the Gemara have to mention that Rabbi Abba came back from a boat trip? Right? Why is that necessary? So I was thinking about this, because remember, there's nothing like, what does that piece of information do for us? So I was thinking about so just watch what's happening over here in the Gemara. We have a Mishnah, Machlokes Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim. We have a whole Machlokes over here. Do they argue? Do they not argue? Do they come to an agreement? So I'll say, here's what's amazing. Rabbi Abba goes on the boat. So I will say, sometimes if you want clarity in life, what do you need? You need to take yourself out of the circumstances, and you need to be able to look at things with a clear mind. Sometimes when you're in the midst of it, when you're in the thick of it, you can't always see things for what they are. So Rabbi Abba goes, I don't think he's going on a pleasure cruise, right? He's not going on a sunset sailboat cruise. He's traveling somewhere, but sometimes just being out of your circumstances allows you to see things in a different light, which is such an incredible yesod in life. That's why in Chassidus, there's such an important emphasis on hisbodedus, on being alone with oneself, because we all have things that we're struggling with, right? And often it's very frustrating because I can't figure out the solutions to my issues. And often that's because I'm actively embedded in them. Sometimes in order to find resolution, I need to remove myself. This is what Chazal say, Ein chavush matirs atzu beis ha'asur. The person incarcerated in the jail cannot free himself from the jail. You often can't see the resolution for your circumstances when you're in the circumstances. But if you find a way to remove yourself a little bit, right, that hisbodedus, that time with yourself, sometimes gives you, right, it's the proverbial boat ride. You get on the boat, remove yourself from the circumstances, and suddenly you have a kind of say, by the way, this happens all the time. Even a person takes a few minutes to go on a drive somewhere, to go on a walk somewhere out of your regular circumstances. It opens your mind in a different way. This is why, again, this notion of hisbodedus. In any event, Rabbi Abba goes on his boat ride. He has clarity. That Rabbi Gamliel and the Chacham agree by Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that ultimately you could rely on the Shliach Tzibor to discharge your obligations. So the Gemara says, 1 second. V'alacha michlal de pligi bebrachas techol Hashana. And it appears that ultimately, again, that halacha lemaisa, where is their argument? Their argument is by the rest of the year. Right? That's what the argument is. Ini, is that so? So we'll say, by the way, we'll discuss why would the tefillos of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur be different. We'll get to that in just a moment. Ini, v'amar Rav Chana Tzipora, Rabbi Yochanan, halacha Rabbi Gamliel bebrachas shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom Kippurim. Ultimately, so we'll say, so once again, you see Rabbi Yochanan making a statement. The halacha follows Rabbi Gamliel by Shmona Esrei of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Now we'll say, once again, like we said before, whenever the Gemara needs to make a declarative statement that the halacha follows a particular person, what does that tell us? That there's a machlokes. So then obviously what that sounds like is the Chachamim didn't agree with Rabbi Gamliel by Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Ella Amrav Nachman by Yitzchak, Man Modim. We'll say, what does it mean when we say Modim? They agreed. Rabbi Meir. It's Rabbi Meir agreed. V'halacha michlal de pligi Rabbanon. And the halacha means that the Rabbanon still disagreed. Why? What happened? We'll say, here we go. Tisanya, Barachos, Sharash Hashanah, V'shiyom Kippurim, Shliach Tzibor, Motzi, Rabbim, Dechabasan, Divrei Rabbi Meir. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, quoting now over here, different than Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that the Shliach Tzibor has the ability to discharge the obligation of anyone in Shmonas Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. These words are Meir v'Chachamim Omnecham say Kashem sheshliach tzibor chayiv kach kol yachid v'yachid chayiv. And ultimately the Chachamim say the same way the shliach tzibor is chayiv, so too every individual is chayiv. So we'll say, so it turns out before we get to the reasoning for this, turns out the Chachamim do disagree. Right, the Chacham disagree even by Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they will hold that even by Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the same way the Shliach Tzibor has an obligation to daven, every individual has an obligation to daven. What it turns out is Rabbi Gamliel is not alone in his assertion that the Shliach Tzibor can be motzi the individuals by Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Who else agrees with him? Rabbi Meir. To which the Gemara says, by the way, my shnahani. Let's analyze this for just a moment. Why would the tefillos of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur be different than the rest of the year? That you would have opinions that say, even though during the rest of the year you should really daven on your own, by Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur you could rely on the tefillos of the Shliach Tzibor. So why is it different? Listen to this. The Gemara says, "My shnahani ilima mishum dina fishi krai." I will say, this is a very simple reason. So you will say, think about this for just a moment. You have Malchias, Zichronos, and Shofros. Malchias, Zichronos, and Shofros have 10 psukim each. But say, remember again, you're talking about people davening Baal Peh, right, by heart, by memory. So no one's remembering that. I should say no one. Right? They will say that is a lot to remember. And remember again, you're only saying this Shmona Esrei by Rosh Hashanah 2 days a year, right, at most. And Yom Kippur, 1 day a year. So Allah Chalamaisi, you're going to remember all of these things. To which the Gemara says fasting. Rav Chananel said on the name of Rav, Kevan Shamar Ubisorascha Kasuv Lemor Shuv Enot Tzarech. Rabbi said, this is incredible. This is fascinating. So the Gemara says, technically, listen to how fascinating this is. If when you get to Malchias, Zichronos, and Shofros, if you just say the phrase Ubisorascha Kasuv Lemor, in your Torah it says as follows, right? Look at Rashi. Kevan Shamar Ubisorascha Kasuv Kilomar Kevan Shamar Nasa V'naklu Fanecha Ki Mitzvas Ritzonecha Ki Moshe Kasavta Alinu B'Sorosecha. I will say, as long as you make reference to the fact that the psukim, which back up that which you are saying in Shemona Esrei, are written in the Torah, you don't even have to say the psukim. Right? Isn't this interesting? So as long as you say B'sarascha kasu lemor in your Torah, it says, even if you don't actually articulate the psukim, your yotzei, which is another way of saying, I will say that you don't actually have to know all of the psukim of Musaf by heart. You don't have to know it by heart. As long as you make reference to the fact that the psukim that are part of the tefillah are written in the Torah, that's enough. That's enough. So I will say, so you see from here, even if you don't remember all the psukim, ultimately it's okay. So therefore, why should you be reliant on the shliach tzibur? Elamishum da'avshi brachas. Rather, we'll say you have to say it's because avshi. Rashi says, what's avshi? Rashi says, elamishum da'avshi sharikan teisha va'arukos umatos de'ein hakol bekiyin bahen. So we'll say, because Rashi says, it's a long Shemona Esrei, and the brachas are difficult. And there's a lot of words and a lot of concepts that most of us are not familiar with because we do not recite them on a daily basis. Rashi says as follows. So fine. So the idea over here is as follows. The opinion of the Gemara says it's a difficult Shemona Esrei. And because it's a difficult Shemona Esrei, people are going to have difficulty with it. See, I will say there's also like a tension over here. The tension over here is the ability to say Shemona Esrei and be totally focused on just remembering the words with the potential of sacrificing kavanah versus the ability of not having to worry about the words and being able to have the kavanah by just concentrating on that which the shliach tzibor is saying. So Rabbi Gamliel seems to be of the opinion we would rather you go ahead and have the kavanah, rely on the shliach tzibor, and not have to spend all of your mental energy trying to remember the actual Shemona Esrei, versus spending the mental energy remembering the Shemona Esrei, and ultimately, again, not having the kavanah. And I will say, now, of course, all of this presupposes that what? People don't have what? Don't have what? Their own machzorim. Right? So remember, understand, like what a privilege we have when we daven, right? Not only do we have machzorim, but again, you have English, right? We have commentaries. We have all different kinds of things. We have supplements, right? It's really an incredible thing. So I'll say, Rabbi Gamliel says, Shemona Esrei of Rosh Hashanah is really complicated. So because it's complicated, halacha l'maisa, we rather people concentrate, be yotze with the shliach tzibor, than break their teeth over trying to remember what the words of the Shemona Esrei are. So Gemara says, Gufa, Amrav Chananel Amarav, Kevan Shar B'Surah Kasule Mar Shuv Enot Zarech. So remember, as we just said before, if you're downloading Shemona Esrei, even if you don't say the psukim of Musaf, this is by Yam Norab. Even if you don't say the psukim of Musaf, if you just say B'Surah Kasuv Leimar, that's enough. So the Gemara says, Savra Minei Hani Mili B'Yachid Aval B'Tzibor Lo. We'll say this dispensation only works when you're davening by yourself. But by Tefillah B'Tzibor, ultimately the Chazan can't say that. Right? The Chazan can't get away with saying B'Surah Kasuv Leimar. The Chazan has to say all of the psukim as well. So the Gemara says, Itmar, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Echad Yochid, Echad Tzibor, Kevan Shamar B'Surah Kasuv Leimar Shuv Enot Zarech. Yetabos, you have Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi saying, both by an individual and by the Chazan, by the collective. If you just said B'Surah Kasuv Leimar, you're yotzei. So Amar Rabbi Lazar, the Olam, he said, good. So I'll say, so ultimately we have a machlokes. Amar Rabbi Lazar, the Olam Yasdir. The Olam Yasdir. So I'll say, very, very beautiful Gemara. The Olam Yasdir, Adam Tfilaso. The achar kach yispalo. Both say in general a person should first organize his tfilos and then he should daven. I will say what does that mean? What does that mean? Make sure you're properly prepared ultimately for tefillah. Now I will say from the Gemara's perspective, what this meant initially was as follows. The shliach tzibor was often davening by heart, bal peh. So what it meant for the shliach tzibor is that halacha l'maisa, make sure you know what you're going to say. And by the way, not just for the shliach tzibor, but for the individual also. Before you daven Shemona Esrei, make sure you're good, right? To make sure you know what it is that you're going to say. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Abba mistabra milsei Rabbi Lazar bebrachos shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom Kippurim v'shel Prakim. So Rabbi Abba says it makes sense that what is this referring to? The brachos of Shemona Esrei of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Prakim. Rashi says Prakim is moados, which means any time you're davening a Shemona Esrei with which you are not familiar, right? So anytime you daven a Shemona Esrei that you're not familiar with, take the time before you daven to organize your thoughts and to make sure that the tefillah is organized in your head. Aval d'chola shana lo. Let's say, but the general Shmona Esrei you daven throughout the year, we assume that what? There is a familiarity with that. So because of familiarity with that, you don't have to go ahead and pause ahead of time. So I'll say, if you think about this idea, by the way, it's actually really incredible. This notion of the olam yastir adam tfilaso, the achar kach yispalel. Organize your tefillah and then daven. Organize your tefillah and then daven. So again, on a basic level, it's quite literal. Make sure before you daven Shmona Esrei, you know in your mind which brachas that are part of Shmona Esrei. Qualification of that, well, that's not for year-long Shmona Esrei. That's only for what we call episodic Shmona Esrei. Rosh Hashana, Yom Kippur, Yamim Tovim, because you're not as familiar with that. So the Gemara says, Imi, is that so? Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda, Mesader Tzeluse Umatzli. You know, let's listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda, when he would even daven the regular weekday Shmona Esrei, he would take time before Shmona Esrei to organize his thoughts. Right, to organize the tefillah. We'll say this is wild. Shani Rabbi Yehuda was different. Kevan de mitlasin yomin litlasin yomin have matzlei kiprakim damu. Rabbi Yehuda would only daven once every 30 days. He only daven once every 30 days. So because of that, because you're like, hey, I know guys like that, right? And so again, he'd only daven once every 30 days, right? Why? Now we'll say, why was that? Look at Rashi. This is incredible. So Rashi says, mitlasin litlasin shayamachzer talmudo kol shloshim. We'll say this is back in Brachas. We saw this. We'll say the concept. There's a concept of mi shetoraso umnaso, someone who is wholly and fully and totally occupied by the pursuit of Torah. Someone who spends every moment learning is exempt from tefillah. Is exempt from davening. Rabbi Yehuda was one of those types of people. Rabbi Yehuda would learn the entire day, and as such, he was Torah. So Torah was his occupation. He was exempt from tefillah, and he would go ahead and literally review his entire cycle of learning every 30 days. So as such, there was only a pause in his learning once every 30 days. When there was that pause, that's when he would daven. That's when he would daven. So I'll say, so because Rabbi Yehuda only davened once every 30 days, therefore what? For him, a regular weekday Shmona Esrei was the equivalent of an episodic Shmona Esrei, right? And therefore, before he davened, he organized his thoughts. So I'll say, I want to point out, scholars like Rabbi Yehuda, they were the exception, right? This was not the norm. Even amongst the greatest of the great, this was not. So I'll tell you, there's a beautiful Sasemes. The Sasemes says, but there are plenty. He points out there are plenty of people that Torah umnasam, that Torah was their occupation, yet they still daven. So the Sasemes says something so beautiful. He says, because the more you learn, the more you want to daven. He says something so beautiful. He says, davening is the dialogical connection with the Ribbon Shalom. It's the ability to talk to your Father. So the more I learn, the more steeped in my Father I am, the more steeped in the relationship, and the more I have to tell him, the more I have to talk with him. So ultimately, again, the Sasem says that's why you had many people who technically satisfied the criteria of Torasam Umnasam. Torah was their occupation. But again, that Torah pushed them to want to daven even more. But again, the Gemara is quoting Rabbi Yehuda from a halachic perspective, that if someone is fully and totally preoccupied, ultimately there is. Let's finish. I will say, Rabbi Gamliel used to exempt the people in the field from davening. Now, I will say, now what does that mean? So the Am Shebesados, I will say something very interesting. The Am Shebesados means the workers in the field who were unable to come to shul. Rabbi Gamliel felt that they discharged their obligation of tefillah through the Shliach Tzibor. The Shliach Tzibor has them in mind, and he discharges his obligation. So the Gemara says, "V'lo miboy hani dekayma hacha," and it goes without saying that, of course, the people in the shul could discharge the obligation through the Shliach Tzibor. So we'll say, this is Rabbi Gamliel l'shitaso. Rabbi Gamliel holds you could discharge your obligation through the Shliach Tzibor, even if you know how to daven. What Rabbi Gamliel is adding is not only can the people in the shul discharge the obligation, but what? Even the Am Shebesados, the people in the field who can't make it to shul, may not even have time to daven, can be with the Shliach Tzibor. So Gemara says, 1 second, Adrabah, Hani Anisi, Hani Lo Anisi. Not necessarily. Maybe Rabbi Gamliel only allows the Am Shebesados to discharge their obligation. With the Shliach Tzibor. Why? Because they're in the field. They have extenuating circumstances. However, again, people in shul, what do you have to do if you're in shul? Daven yourself. You can't discharge your obligation. To which the Gemara says, to give you another example of this, Tani, Abba Bered Rabbi Yamin Barchia, will say, if you stand behind the Kohanim during Duchening, you're not included in Birkas Kohanim. I say, right? So you're not included in Birkas Kohanim if you stand behind the Kohanim. Listen to this. Elo ki asa Rabin Amar Yaakov Bar Idi Amar Shimon Chasida lo patra b'gamliel ela am shebesados. I'm sorry, did I skip here? I'm sorry. Elo ki asa Rabin Amar Yaakov Bar Idi Amar Shimon Chasida lo patra b'gamliel. So I'll say. So again, let me point this. Let me tell you the unwritten part of the Gemara. So interestingly enough, the Gemara says is that halacha lemaisa, if you're standing behind the Kohanim, you're not Yotzei Birchas Kohanim. Yet the Gemara Maseches Brachas says the Am Shebesados, the workers in the field, are included in Birchas Kohanim. So what do you see from here? You see something very interesting. That in halacha, if you have extenuating circumstances, we'll find a way to include you in collective service. But at the end of the day, if you don't have extenuating circumstances and you're there and you're present, then Allah Chamaisi, you got to get it right. So if you're in shul and you're standing behind the Kohanim, ultimately, again, you won't be Yotzei. But if you're in the field, you will be Yotzei. So you see, we make a distinction between people with extenuating circumstances versus people who are present. To which the Gemara says, Elaki Asa Rabin Amar Rabbi Yaakov Amar Bar Idi Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida Lo Pater Rabbi Gamliel Ela Am Shebesados. At the end of the day, Rabbi Gamliel only exempted the Am Shebesados. What that means is that halacha lemaisa, they can discharge their obligation with the Shliach Tzibor. My taima mishum da'anisi b'malacha. Why? Because they are nusin, they have extenuating circumstances because of the work they have to perform. Aval bi'ir lo. But those in the city, no. What does that mean, those in the city? No, Rashi says, Aval bi'ir lo, mishum delo anisi v'yecholin lahastir tfilasan. Since ultimately, again, they have the ability to go ahead and organize on Shemona. So therefore, Rabbi say, what comes out of it is something fascinating. That even Rabbi Gamliel, who was originally saying that you could always discharge your obligation with the Shliach Tzibor, right? Comes around and says, not so fast. You could always use the Shliach Tzibor throughout the year of what? You have an extenuating circumstance. What's your extenuating circumstance? Either A, classic extenuating circumstance, you don't know how to daven, right? Other classic, a geographic extenuating circumstance, you're in the field and you can't get to the shul. But even Rabbi Gamliel agrees that Allah Lamaisa, if you're in shul and you know how to daven, then what? Then Allah Lamaisa, you have to go ahead and daven on your own. Rabbi say, isn't it incredible that the Masechta ends off with this profound message, which is, there are mechanisms in Yiddishkeit to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. There are mechanisms like that. We actually just learned this in the Chassidus Shir lesson, the Chassidus Chabura. There are mechanisms. HaKadosh Baruch Hu leaves no man behind. If you have no, if you learn Rabbi Yitzchak, if you don't have seichel, right? If you don't know what to do, you're an Am Shebesados. There are mechanisms that are there to take care of you. The Shliach Tzibur will take care of you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will take care of you. If you can't take care of yourself, the system will take care of you. But at the end of the day, if you have the ability to seize the reins of your existence, if you have the ability to daven on your own, if you have the ability ultimately again to be in front of the Kohanim, if you have the ability to take charge of your circumstances, you cannot be reliant on others. You must take the reins of your existence. You must take responsibility for your tfilos. You must take responsibility for your brachos. You must take responsibility to make good things happen for yourself in life. And let's say, Shkoyach Hadron Alach Yom Tov V'Slikalei Maseches Rosh Hashana. Let's say, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Tomorrow is a wonderful Chazara day in Mirz Hashem. Sunday morning, B'Shah Tova U'Matzlachas. We begin Maseches Tainus. Haba Lina L'Tova. Shkoyach HaLosei. All right, Chevra on Zoom. Mazel Tov, everyone. A good Shabbos, Shkoyach. See everyone on Sunday, Mirz Hashem. Never made a